Anyone with a question? Well, you've stumped them. L'amour. Charles, the provocateur.
I have a question. Thinking back to big countries and change, the thought occurred to me as you were talking, panellists, about Mahatma Gandhi and India in 1947 and the strategy. So he says, right, we have to change India. There's enormous power of England. And can we learn anything from that strategy that he employed that then led to independence in 1947? And you were talking about vision. It was a powerful vision, a one-word vision of independence. But I really haven't studied enough, but you reminded me of that amazing process.
Absolutely. Anyone, I mean, do we see leaders like this coming forward? They're still so full of romance. You've completely stumped them. Do you need some Thomas?
That's a tough question to answer because leaders have a harder role today than in the past. This level of transparency that we've created, this overall level of awareness, has put them under constant scrutiny. And so at least the political systems that we have today tend to be non-functional as a result of that. Any of you want to chime in on that?
No, I think we've stumped them. Let's move right along.
I would just say one thing, just using Gandhi as a metaphor. If you look at the way Gandhi approached the problem, it is very consistent with the research and writing about disruptive innovation, which is instead of trying to go into the established system and try to make that system better, find a wholly different way to frame the problem. And in the business world, disruptive innovation is something that competes in a new way. It doesn't make it better, it makes it simpler, cheaper, more affordable, more accessible. And this notion of trying to not just play the game better, but to change the game, change the playing field, change the way that we lead things, I think that notion, the Gandhian spirit, I think is a really important spirit for how we're going to drive transformation for any of our big social problems. Now, whether you have individuals that can be, every individual is a function of the place and time and the individual person. Obviously, it's a different time now than it was then, but I think there certainly is room for bold leaders taking bold vision, having bold results. Where they'll come from, who knows?
Well, Gandhi, I think, is unique in recent history, and it's worth remembering it took 60 years, I think, from the founding of the Congress to independence, so a lot of patience. A radically different strategy, satyagraha, which quite a lot of movements around the world do follow, though very hard in the Middle East in the last year or two to actually use non-violent protests and absorb the blows of your enemy in order to weaken them. Didn't really work in Syria very well, that. And in some ways, I think the most fascinating thing about Gandhi is that after Indian independence, almost everything he recommended was ignored. And the government pursued an anti-Gandhian strategy, and still is. And now, as the debate is almost sort of coming full circle to perhaps some of those Gandhian ideas about a more sustainable, localized economy, almost the opposite of the kind of corporate models you were describing, the question is, can some of that be reintegrated into India's vision of 21st century economy? But it's not at all clear who will win that argument.
Fascinating. Just yesterday.
Situation where on one hand you're talking about needing much better leadership, but there is an extraordinary level of disengagement, of civic participation, disengagement in Western countries, particularly with young people who think that not much they do is really going to make a substantial difference on the world stage, with some notable sort of social media exceptions. So how do you actually get young people engaged? This is a really practical nuts and bolts question. How do you actually connect with them in a way that is going to get them involved so that they will sit down and look at how we solve the problems, instead of saying too hard and shutting off, I'll go talk to my friends on Facebook?
Thanks, Leslie.
Well, maybe to kick things off, it's very odd, the contrast between what social scientists would say about what you've described and general perception. So the general perception is, as you say, young people just having fun, spending all their time on Facebook, not involved in activism of any kind. The statistics, certainly in Europe and North America, show a steady rise of activism over the last 30 or 40 years. So the typical levels of signing a petition, being on a demonstration, so consumer boycott, all these sort of things, much more than in the late 60s. Very surprising, but the numbers have steadily gone up. What they're not doing is believing in political parties as the vehicles for change. So most of that energy is going into other sorts of campaign and movement, and many global ones, many environmental ones. So I don't really buy the kind of apathetic youth story. I think they are highly active, but in slightly different ways. But there is a problem, and we did some research last year looking at examples around the world of online activism, because there's a lot of fascinating innovation of big online platforms like Avaz and so on, which founded in Australia, mobilizing millions. But the problem often, we found young people very good at being mobilized on online platforms, but the offline world of power essentially ignores them. So you've got a kind of disconnect between actually lots of energy and activism and organizing, much of it across national boundaries, but finding it really hard to have traction on big business, big government, which is still essentially offline and ignores it. So if you've got an answer to that, that'd be really helpful.
So how do we connect them, I guess, would be the next logical connection.
The online world has made it easier and easier to take little baby steps to get involved. The easiest way to get involved is to just click the like button. That's just a tiny little piece of involvement. Extend your reputation into that little space there. But it's kind of like Geoff says, is we haven't really connected all the dots yet. We're still building that playing field.
And part of this is just a matter of time. As you have generations that grow up communicating in different ways, working in different ways, it just naturally happens. That the online-offline connection doesn't need to happen because it's all online. Now you're talking, well, you're the futurist, so you should predict this, not me. But I think my own observation is very similar to some of the statistics that Geoff quoted. As I look at some of the young people we're bringing into our organization, I see a group that is committed to social change, certainly different than even my generation, and then the generation before that. You see young people who are committed to multiple causes, and I think the ability to find like-minded people online, where they might have been one in a physical community, but all of a sudden there can be hundreds or thousands in a virtual community, makes it a lot easier. So I think you're naturally going to have more of those blends happen over time, as you do sense that there is something in the younger generation where on issues like some of the ones we've talked about, climate change in particular, just status quo is not making people particularly happy. I've seen this in Singapore too. You look at the younger generation in Singapore, there's a lot of energy around doing things differently. Of course, Singapore is a great country, has achieved a tremendous amount in the last 40 or 50 years, but you saw in the last election, there is a degree to which people are looking for some change, and leaders have had to respond to that.